So thank you all again for joining us. I am the moderator of this panel, this workshop piece, which is really just a fancy way of saying I'm going to get out of the way. I want to introduce our discussants and then let them do their thing. This panel is going to attempt to talk about and think about the poem Riot, which is certainly a very important piece in the context of Miss Brooks' work, but I think also a particularly important poem in thinking about now and in sort of examining or re-examining her legacy through a contemporary lens, right? Because we find ourselves in a particular political moment, in a moment of social unrest and social uprise that is perhaps the largest since the time in which she writes this piece. That, I think, will sort of, be the background or be the baseline through which we think about what the presenters have to say. But I'm really interested and excited to hear them present some papers that I've gotten a chance to read, where they really dive in I think, really brilliant ways into a sort of close read of this text and its three parts and the import of it. So I just want to take a moment to introduce in the order that they will be presenting. So David Baker is the author of 11 books of poetry, recently Scavenger Loop and Never Ending Birds, which won the Theodore Rothke Memorial Poetry Prize in 2011. His 5 prose books include Show Me Your Environment, essays on poetry, poets, and poems, and Radiant Lyre, essays on lyric poetry. Among his awards are prizes and grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, National Endowment for the Arts, Mellon Foundation, and Society of Midland Authors. He teaches at Denison University and occasionally in the Warren Wilson MFA program, and he is the poetry editor of the Kenyon Review. Second, we will have Carl Phillips. Carl Phillips is the author of 13 books of poetry, most recently Reconnaissance and Silver Chest. His latest book of prose is The Art of Daring, Risk, Relentlessness, and Imagination, and he has translated Sophocles. His honors include the PEN USA Award in Poetry, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Poetry, the Kingsley Tufts Award, 2 Lambda Literary Awards and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Library of Congress, and the Academy of American Poets. Currently, he is the judge for the Yale Younger Poets Series, and Phillips teaches at Washington University in St. Louis. Last but certainly not least is Megan O'Rourke. Megan is the author of the memoir, The Long Goodbye, and the poetry collections Once and Half-Life. And the poetry collection Once and Half-Life was awarded the inaugural May Sarton Poetry Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Radcliffe Fellowship, among other prizes. She teaches at Princeton and NYU, and she is currently working on a book about chronic illnesses. She lives in Brooklyn, where she grew up, and also in Marfa, Texas. Please welcome our readers, and I'm excited to hear what y'all have to say. Okay.
I appreciate Nate's custody of our little group, and I'm very grateful, like everybody has said, to Quarish and Lauren and others who've put this together in celebration of one of our great poets. An honor to be with you this afternoon in Gwendolyn Brooks' city, and my daughter's city, as it turns out, who just moved here with her first job, making money. Yes, sir. Here in Gwendolyn Brooks' city in National Poetry Month, right? Do we know that? Did you know it's also National Confederate History Month? How about them apples? It is National Irritable Bowel Syndrome Month. It is National Fresh Florida Tomato Month. It is National Sports Eye Injury Month. It is Peach Month, Frog Month, Kite Month, Welding Month, and Grilled Cheese Sandwich Month. How about that? What do it mean? Carl and Megan and I have been working on Riot and on these little essays for a couple of years. Very hard poem. This is a little paper about the first section. Trauma tends to paralysis. The traumatized are struck, as in shock, into inaction in a posture of wordless gaping. After great pain, she says, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. Or as another theorist of disaster has written, Maurice Blanchot, we feel that there cannot be any experience after the disaster, even if we were to understand disaster to be the ultimate experience. This is one of its features. It impoverishes all experience, withdraws from experience all authenticity. It keeps its vigil only when night watches without watching over anything. Blanchot knows firsthand what it means to die and become alive again. In his post-traumatic memoir of his own near extermination by firing squad, The Instant of My Death, he tries to write that feeling of extraordinary lightness, sovereign elation, when the guns were lowered and the squad moved away. At this moment of doubleness, this is his quote, dead dash immortal, he realizes he cannot try to analyze, and then aftermath. Just so the ecstatic dissolves. To be standing beside himself or away from himself, out of himself, ecstasis, is also to be standing for himself entirely. The result is both mundane and plural, as if the death outside of him could only henceforth collide with the death in him. An unarmed Missourian, Michael Brown, was shot to death on August 9, 2014, in Ferguson by a fellow Missourian, a policeman, Darren Wilson. Mundane and plural. Please understand me, no individual death is mundane. Brown's death was tragic and criminal, like Walter Scott's, who was shot in the back 8 times by a South Carolina policeman, Michael Slager, and thus plural, many times over. The recurrent and persistent horror of police shootings of unarmed people, young people, people of color, young men, the history of our country's worst horror and abiding shame that ranges from castration to lynching, one at a time brutality, as well as civil war. All our civil wars and uncivil wars is so recurrent and persisting as to appear to some mundane. It is the unmatched horror of seeing and living with brutality, long settled into horrible habit and sanctioned, as it were, by the state, by the very state of things. In Brown's case, the resulting response ranged, past tense, from outrage on all sides to riots, to calls for action, even for poetry. Yet I could not myself then write a poem. I have since written specifically about Ferguson, but like many, I imagine the trauma and anger and sorrow find themselves articulated also, as Dickinson said, at a slant. What I did on the first night of the riot was not riot, but read. I turned to 2 poems, Whitman's When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, and something by Gwendolyn Brooks I had read many years before and not since. Riot is by Gwendolyn Brooks, a poem and a book, a tiny book. I forgot to bring it. A tiny book. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's very hard to get your hands on this, and out of print for so long, and they won't reprint it. A tiny book in 3 parts. The first part is the title poem. It totals 14 pages of print and includes, because I'm a book geek, her own handwritten version of the last section. It is a work markedly different from Brooks's famous earlier work. It is not typically part of the Brooks canon. I mean those anthologizable, more easily teachable poems, The Bean Eater, We Real Cool, the rich portraits and populated neighborhoods right here in Bronzeville, with its old relatives and crazy women, its children of the poor, the gay chaps and poo-pooing preachers establishing her reputation so quickly that her second book, Annie Allen, in 1950 won the Pulitzer Prize. She was the first black poet. She seemed to prefer this designation to African American to win this prize. Here are the opening lines of Riot. John Cabot, out of Wilma, once a Wycliffe, all white blue rose below his golden hair, wrapped richly in right linen and right wool, almost forgot his jaguar and Lake Bluff. Almost forgot Grantley, which is the best thing that ever happened to Scotch. Almost forgot the sculpture at the Richard Gray in Distelheim, the kidney pie at Maxime's, the grenadine de boeuf at Maison Henri, because the Negroes were coming down the street, because the poor were sweaty and unpretty, not like two dainty Negroes in Winnetka, and they were coming toward him in rough ranks. In seas, in wind sweep, they were black and loud, and not detainable, and not discreet. What just happened here? Where are we? John Cabot. Who? Gone are many characteristics of Brooks' earlier work, a fairly overt exterior narrative and linear chronology, a fixed or stable speaker, an individual persona with a voice lifted out of the South Side neighborhood and into, as she said, a small second-floor apartment at the corner. Gone are the distinct and distinctly drawn characters, the jazzy mood, the ballad and sermon and blues intonations of her earlier poems. What we have instead is an intense, interiorized, self-referential work that feels more fragmented than complete, more cubist, more elliptical, more postmodern than finished or tidily coherent. Its references seem social, they are uncontextualized and unexplained, and it leads into the poem's second section, whose primary strength, quote, is how it uses collage, to cite a colloquium from Jacket 2. What happened here, in fact, is a riot. Reverend King authorizes the poem with his opening assertion epigraph that a riot is the language of the unheard, and the poem does not confirm, rather it assumes this circumstance as it assumes our complicity in knowing, and in fact we cannot not know what we know. The triggering event is King's assassination, April 4, 1968, and the aftermath riots in the West Side of a city infamous for race riots, including the 1919 riots, which featured heavily militarized police and 38 deaths. The poem begins in the aftershock of trauma and seems to describe the fear and apparently or likely the death of one John Cabot, he of the golden hair. A critic calls this a revolutionary, revisionary, and even aspirational history. In reality, no white people died in the riots. All 11 people who died were black. So, who's John Cabot? A fiction? A figment? A straw figure? We know the name from history books if we look. John Cabot, Giovanni Cobato, under commission from Henry VII, explored swaths of this continent in 1497, claiming North America for England, one of its first colonial appropriations of the New World. And we know John Cabot, according to the Jacket 2 critics, as, quote, the name of an original Boston Brahmin, about whose family it is said, and this is good old Boston, where the Lowells talk only to Cabots and the Cabots talk only to God. We know our John Cabot is indeed talking to God, or, he says, any handy angel, praying in horror, don't let it touch me, the blackness, Lord. He sees the windsweep of Negroes coming down the street. He is grossed out by them. But gross, I'm going to read this section in a minute, may describe his own appetite or obesity. 2, his outsized hunger for kidney pie and grenadine de boeuf, as for other opulent aspects of his lifestyle, perhaps faux European, fancy cars, fine clothes, rarefied Scotch whiskey. Though Grantley is actually a cheap after-dinner liqueur, as well as a Scottish village pronounced Grantley. As he lived, he seems, this artificial JC, to die expensively, burning like the body of another holy martyr, John Wycliffe. I'll read the poem's second half. I'm going to read it all. I'm going to read the last line. I don't know how. It has a hurtful word, and it's not right coming from my lips. But it's her poem, and I honor that. Gross, Qu'as-tu grossé? John Cabot itched instantly beneath the nourished white that told his story of glory to the world. Don't let it touch me, the blackness. Lord, he whispers to any handy angel in the sky. But in a thrilling announcement, on it drove and breathed on him and touched him in that breath the fume of pigfoot, chitling, and cheap chili, malign, mocked John, and in terrific touch, old averted doubt jerked forward decently, cried, Cabot, John, you are a desperate man and desperately die expensively today. John Cabot went down in the smoke and fire and broken glass and blood, and he cried, Lord, forgive these niggers that know not what they do. Aftermath. The poem seems to embody a tactic Brooks herself deliciously called verse journalism. I have always thought of myself as a reporter, but then again, who the hell is John Cabot? Is he not fictive rather than real? Does Brooks not seem empowered now increasingly to imagine as well as document? Throughout Riot, her poetic grows ever more complex and multiple, even here in this first section, as her point of view is a superimposition, one on another, shared, plural, blended, yet also capable of particularizing time, sympathy, culpability, and indictment. Aftermath. Riot, the sequence's first part, exists forcefully as an artful expression of chaos, the first coming into words utterance of a stunned stupor in the wake of assassination. Riot sounds like rage, but it exists with equal force and fixity as an expression of the poet's confidence, her profound risk-taking as she grows and develops. It's not that Brooks is turning away from her earlier poetic self, she is rather becoming her later self, more fierce, yet also more elliptical. In '67, as we know, she attended the second Fisk Black Writers Conference, the first conference in '66, during another aftermath, the Watts riots, the assassinations of Malcolm X and Medgar Evers, both of whom show up with their own poems in the Mecca, called for a new black writing affiliated with the black arts movement. In Riot, we see Brooks helping to shape this aesthetic. We also see her opting out of a number of mainstream or established conventions, her celebrated signature idiom, her finesse with traditional prosody and form. If the first part of Riot, what you have is loose pentameter, or at least decasyllabic and hendecasyllabic lines, like the King quote, in fact. The subsequent sections eschew such formalism, as Carl Phillips' essay will examine. Elizabeth Alexander says about Brooks's early work that she is nothing short of a technical virtuoso, with an impressive formal range of sonnets, ballads, spirituals, blues, full of off-rhymes. She also opts out of other aspects that made her famous. Riot is Brooks's first book after she decided to leave Harper & Row and invest, as it were, in a black publisher. In this case, Broadside Press, which Dudley Randall founded in 1965 and ran out of a spare bedroom and later a church basement in Detroit. That is, Brooks shifts her own cultural capital from New York to the Midwest, from a white board of trustees to community publishing, in a decision James Sullivan calls a profound anti-economic move. It's one thing to write black, to maketh a brand new black, and a further one to say, as Brooks said, I couldn't possibly think of going back to any white publisher. I'll always be with a black publisher. It's true that Brooks expressed a little doubt about Riot later. Perhaps it was, she said, too meditative. But what she calls meditative may be the powerful interiority of her new style. Certainly it is not sincere, serene. It is not self-contained or self-reflexive. It is not in its mood or method contemplative. It is powerfully dramatic, performed by a shifting cast of voices and not a single monologue. It is powerfully narrative, though its narrative field is highly elliptical, inferential, and fluid as a photographer's multiple exposure. Aftermath. An unarmed citizen, Abraham Lincoln, was shot to death on April 14, 1865. He died the next morning in Washington, D.C., shot by a fellow citizen, the famous actor John Wilkes Booth. The Civil War stands as a kind of sustained, traumatizing riot, fought in the nation's own backyards and neighborhoods. And Walt Whitman's great poem, The Lilac Elegy, stands not just for the martyred Lincoln, not just for the legions of sacrificed war dead, but for the ideal notion of perfectibility, democracy's promising dream of equality and fairness. It was a riot of race, economics, and power. To express his grief, but also to enact a sympathetic martyrdom, Whitman, too, dies in his poem, his unsurpassed eloquence erased by horror and disillusionment. The great poet of the people retreats to a dismal, inhuman swamp, giving himself over to grief. Dead, immortal, says Blanchot. In the same double trope, Whitman is reborn in the song of the hermit thrush who tutors him in nature's forgiving and regenerative process. It is, we appreciate, one of the great acts of transcendental imagination. I'm sure that's why I turned to it when the riot began. And why I turned to Brooks? If Whitman's poem is a masterpiece of transcendence, Brooks's is a masterpiece of something entirely else. She does not transcend, does not rise remade, reunified, or reinvented out of the erasures of history and nature, not for her, the intimate or egotistical sublime. Computer scientists have a term. When they include one document, or let's say one point of view, or voice, or tactic, alongside or inside another one, transclusion. Not to go beyond, but reach beyond to include the other or other things. Textual blending, reaching out to attain the multiple. To perform transclusion is to carry from one thing to another, to overlay, not to go beyond, but to remain changed. So this is the claim I make for Gwendolyn Brooks's art. It is a transclusive art. For Whitman, the figure of Lincoln stood as a figurehead, the ideal representative man, to use Emerson's term, a leader born straight out of the natural environment of the New World. Martin Luther King holds similar esteem and position here in Brooks's post-romantic, post-naturalist vision. But for us, of course, Michael Brown is neither a heroic elected politician, a president, a revered leader of a church, nor the embodiment of a civil rights movement. He was, and is, like us, more mundane, like us, plural. Yet in this way, he is also a representative man, neither hero nor anti-hero, but now, like Walter Scott, like Freddie Gray, like Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Alton Sterling, Sandra Bland, so many more, one of many. Blanchot is here useful again. He reminds us the self is merely a formal necessity, but it does serve to allow the infinite relation of self to other. I know this one thing for certain. No one of us now, no one stunned self can supply a sufficient vision, a sufficient artwork capable of addressing, representing, and correcting the horror of inequity, inequality, and human violence. This was Whitman's realization, and it nearly killed him. It's what Kazim Ali points to when he writes, "When we think of a unified or singular American identity, we lose the chance to truly understand ourselves and one another." The really traumatic question is both plural and mundane. That question is, together, do we stand a chance? Thank you.
Thank you, David. And it's an honor to be here, co-panelists with Nate, with everyone, be part of this conference. Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed the sort of conversation that's been happening between all of the different panels. I'm going to be talking about, to some extent, prosody, which I a little bit of a prosody nerd. Prosody as a kind of form of revolution, another way to protest. Even as someone was talking yesterday, I guess a question came up after one of the panels about why write about a place that's no longer in existence. And I think one reason is because that itself is a form of resistance. To argue against emptiness through the permanence that poetry can provide, or in the same way that I think it can be a form of resistance merely to put pen to paper, you're resisting silence. So I think that Brooks teaches us a few subtle ways of rioting, we could say. David mentioned already this conference at Fisk in 1967, about which Brooks said that until 1967, my own blackness did not confront me with a shrill spelling of itself. What she seems to have meant was that a different kind of feeling, understanding, and writing blackness overcame her. For to be sure, her work prior to this is grounded, as we've seen, in black family, speakers, and issues, but that work was also cast in sonnets, the iambic pentameter line of blank verse, the traditional English prosody, the master's tools, as I sometimes think of them, master as in master and slave, of which Brooks had shown herself to be a master, culminating in the Pulitzer Prize that has been discussed for Annie Allen, a book that both acknowledges a debt to and deftly reworks another white classic, we could say, Virgil's Aeneid. After Fisk, Brooks seems to have had a sort of crisis of prosodic consciousness. It's as if she has to rethink what it means to use English prosodic tradition now that she's subscribed to the Black Arts Movement's imperative to speak specifically to a Black audience in language shaped primarily by motivating content, and less, we could say, in terms of stylistic virtuosity. I'd say that's in the eyes of a largely white critic body. It's not that her poems hadn't been readable by blacks, but her prosody, in a sense, made for a receptive white audience, made her palatable, I want to say, even if in certain poems, like The Lovers of the Poor, she was skewering a white elite's condescending attitude toward blacks. The challenge for Brooks was to come up with a poetry and a prosody to go with it that would speak not so much to a largely white academy as to the kinds of people she'd been documenting, the Bean Eaters, Satin Leg Smith, and the Rangers, those gang members she'd begun working with in writing workshops in Chicago. And this ties in a bit in the context of what you were saying earlier, Nate, about this canonization and what gets anthologized. It seems to me what gets anthologized is what's considered correct poetry, which often feeds into an English prosodic tradition. But also, I think in her attempt to straddle, Brooks's attempt to straddle two different kinds of audiences, we're talking about her desire for the empathy that we've heard about earlier today in poems like the one about the Mississippi Mother poem. Many readers say that this is where Brooks's work goes into decline, suggesting that she abandoned her prosodic gifts, even as she exchanged a high literary idiom for a decidedly more demotic one. It is interesting how evolution in one writer can win praise and in another be disparaged. What I want to look at here is how in her suite of 3 sermons on the warpland, we can see Brooks finding a way to adapt rather than sacrifice her mastery of prosody to her new sense of blackness. And across the 3 sermons, we can see as well an enactment of Brooks's wrestling with, straddling, and ultimately reconciling the seeming conflict between English prosody and the language of Black Revolution. I'm more nervous than I thought I would be. But we continue. How to negotiate the inevitable braid of black and white in American history. The first sermon on the warpland exemplifies that braid, and you have it in its complete form on one of those handouts, but you may not have the handout. But I'll read you just the first 5 lines of it. And several strengths from drowsiness campaigned, but spoke in single sermon on the warpland, and went about the warpland saying, "No, my people, black and black, revile the river, say that the river turns, and turn the river." At the most obvious level, you can hear how for the first 3 stanzas, though I only read you a couple lines, each line is a pentameter line, mostly iambic, with the obvious exceptions of the 4 shortened lines 8 and 10. So, in the tradition of Claude McKay's Harlem Dancer, Cullen's Yet Do I Marvel, and contemporary with Brooks herself, Robert Hayden's Middle Passage, and consistent with all of her work pre-Fisk, Brooks here at the level of meter uses English, white prosody for black purposes, shaping the master's language to her own subject matter, a decidedly non-white one. What I'm more interested in, though, is the rhyme scheme that governs these first three stanzas, one that unites these 14 lines into a stylized sonnet. As you can see, we open with a rhyming couplet, and that's on this handout too, if you're lucky to have one of those magical handouts. Line 3 is the only line that finds no rhyme, deliberately, I'd say. The line itself ends with the word no. It seems appropriate that the imperative to resist yes should resist rhyme's closure. This is followed by the exact rhyme of river and river. But then look at what happens after this, an interlocking set of rhymes that create a kind of triple sonic chiasmus, the kind of thing that thrills me. You know, chiasmus where you have these mirror ideas. So like say you had a rhyme scheme of A, B, B, A. And that's a mirroring effect where they kind of fold in on each other, contain like frames. And in these lines that I've put in the handout, there are three sets of these. There's C, D, D, C as a possibility. There's B, C, C, B. And there is C, D, D, C, those three combinations. So cage within a cage within a cage, we might say, or frame within a frame within a frame. Chiasmus as a rhetorical device tends to suggest sometimes the comfort of containment, other times the claustrophobia of captivity. Brooks seems to be using chiasmus here not to answer, but to provoke questions. How far is captivity from containment? What's the difference between comfort and complacency, between claustrophobia and incipient rage? After which she abandons the sonnet, and this seems to trigger anaphora, that form of repeating the beginning of phrases that's an element of oratory as long ago as Thucydides and Cicero, but also a prominent device in the oratory of the Black Church. Build now your church, my brothers, sisters. Build, never with brick, nor corten, nor with granite. Build with lithe love, with love like lion eyes, with love like morning rise, with love like black, our black, luminously indiscreet, complete, continuous. We've seen it earlier in this poem, but here it governs the stanza, this kind of repetition. 3 sentences beginning with build, 3 with love like, in a stanza of fairly steadily diminishing lines, metrically speaking. 3 pentameter, 2 trimeter, 1 tetrameter, and then the last line that I think of as a 2-beat finale, complete, continuous. But Brooks holds on to chiasmus. One straddles stanzas 3 and 4, where we see sisters and brothers, and at line 9 and at line 15, we have brothers, sisters. Again, that mirroring effect. And then, as if for final reinforcement, the last 2 lines here have a chiasmus of rhyme. Luminously, indiscreet, complete, continuous. So you have an A and B and a B and an A. And I've structured them on the handout so you can see the X they make, which is why it's called chiasmus, the Greek letter for X. What to make of a cage at B that sounds so lovely? Or is this the X, the chi of chiasmus, by which those who cannot sign otherwise leave their mark? The sermon on the Warpland shows Brooks using English prosody as a vehicle for exhorting a black audience to say no, to prepare to meet the pains that will come with resisting the reviled river. In part, the combination of that form and content embody the intertwinedness of blacks and whites, even as the poem's final stanza suggests a departure from English prosody to one that we more associate with black culture. The second sermon on the Warpland strikes me as the enacting of a more complete departure. No ghost of a sonnet here in this poem of 4 sections of widely varying length. Brooks is direct about this in section 2, announcing in a pentameter line that not the pet bird of poets, that sweetest sonnet, shall straddle the whirlwind. Rhyme all but falls away. Chiasmus is absent. No cage, no comfort here. Also gone is any sustained pentameter. Where it appears, it gets quickly undercut by shortened lines. In section 3, lines 2 to 5 are pentameter, but all 3 open with a reversed foot, a revolt from the I am, we could say, and 2 of them are on the baggy side because of some anapests in the mix. The shift from these lines to the 3 that follow feels like stepping into a space that's quieter and more clear. It feels like freedom, a freedom linked to the absence of predictable sonic pattern. You can hear it in this way. All about are the pushmen and jeopardy, theft. All about are the stormers and scramblers, but what must our season be, which starts from fear? Live and go out, define and medicate the whirlwind. So that break out of the pentameter pattern. Restraint and release played out in such a way as to suggest not just prosodic restlessness, but the restlessness of an entire people. Or it also seems as if Brooks is arguing for a kind of equality at the level of prosody and, by extension, the level of human lives. Hence, lines like from section 4, cracks into furious flower, lifts its face, all unashamed and sways in wicked grace, pentameter and rhymed, are on equal footing with lines like what was quoted yesterday in one of the talks, a garbage man as dignified as any diplomat, Big Bessie's feet hurt like nobody's business. This is less a dismantling of English prosody than a rejection of its supremacy. There will have to be room made, the prosody tells us, for otherness, and on an equal footing. Not the least part of the prosody here is how all 4 sections are yoked together by the words live and the phrase the whirlwind at the end of each section, as if the relationship between the whirlwind of racial oppression and the need to live in the face of it were not just the one unavoidable fact, but, strangely, an organizing principle for the poem, yes, but also implicitly for the kind of communal energy required if resistance to injustice is to effect any real change. The 3rd sermon on the war plan is actually part of a sequence, as we know, Riot, but Brooks's title suggests that we are to read this with an understanding of there having been 2 earlier sermons, hence my consideration of the 3 together. The 3rd sermon does stand apart, though, in not being governed by the imperative, that build kind of thing. There's no sense of an addressee. Rather, this sermon unfolds by exposition, a filmic narrative of a riot that has broken out, less exhortation, more notational in style. Many of the lines are of overheard dialogue in a crowd. Some read like stage directions in drama. The English pentameter that figured prominently in the 1st sermon then seemed intertwined with demotic speech in the 2nd, here becomes the minority. More often than not, what pentameter there is seems incidental, as it is in conversation. This seems fitting in a poem in which 2 philosophers, whom Brooks calls simply the black philosopher and the white philosopher, seem to be in their own conversation as they get quoted across the poem. The black philosopher suggesting the violence to come as a result of white complacency, the white philosopher pressing for hope in a time of despair, even as hope becomes force, hope manifested as black violence. So, black rioting against white oppression equals the eradication of English prosody, each an enactment of the other? Not quite. While Brooks has systematically pared away the traditional prosodic elements in the course of her 3 sermons, having cast aside the sonnet as irrelevant to social change in the 2nd sermon, it seems she won't let go entirely. Near the end of the 3rd sermon, I detect a sonnet, not the single 14-line stanza of the poem that serves as an elegy for a dead woman, which is, yes, 14 lines, but not enough of the other elements are here to convince me it's a sonnet. I mean the one 15-line stanza, whose first line announces itself as the title, a poem to Peanut, in which Brooks presents a portrait of the Rangermen as the new heroes. And that, too, is on a handout. You can see that the poem is almost entirely iambic, but maybe you can't, so I'm going to read you some of the lines. Richard, a ranger and a gentleman, a signature, a herald, and a span. This Peanut will not let his men explode. Enrico will not. Neither will Svengali. Those aren't pentameter, but they are iambic, so we have that running through. But then we get back to nor Bach nor Jeff, Geronimo nor lover. Iambic pentameter. 4 of the lines are iambic pentameter, and 5 of the last 6 lines are trimeter. Meanwhile, there's a rhyme scheme of sorts, one that offers us a Shakespearean quatrain, if you want to count that BC moment there, as well as a rhyming couplet for an ending, the DD, yeah, rhyming with up and here. The BCB-CCA of lines 7 through 12 aren't exactly the sestet of a Petrarchan sonnet, but they suggest something of the same patterning of resolution that the sestet offers, even as the A rhyme of Rangermen ties the poem's latter half to the words gentleman and span at the poem's beginning. I think Brooks wants us to think of the sonnet as she wants us to think of heroic tradition, differently, through the lens of blackness as activism, not as presentation piece. My sense is she stood somewhere between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. in terms of her sensibility. She recognizes the usefulness of violence, the necessity for it, But she also somewhere believes, to quote the third sermon's opening line, that the earth is a beautiful place. She won't have it destroyed. Likewise, she won't abandon the traditional English prosody that she so clearly loves, but she seems to have seen its limitations, if not made to adapt to cultural change. Most things revolutionary aren't so much about newness as about understanding the past enough to know what to save of it, and to shape the rest into what, in effect, can bring the old forward to renewed relevance. From the evidence of her 3 sermons on the war plan, this is the achievement of Brooks after Fisk. Hardly a decline, rather she manages to move forward, her gifts intact but newly relevant, deployed in the service of a racial climate vastly different from where she first began. Okay, thanks.
It's wonderful to be here with all of you, and I want to thank the conference organizers who did so much work to get us here. And it's also just a great honor to be here speaking to you about a poet who has come to mean more and more to me the older I've gotten as a poet, in part because of the way that her work, for many reasons, but in part because of the way that her work is a continual response to her own sense of necessity, social necessities, personal necessities, and otherwise. And I'm hoping we'll talk a little bit about some of these things that I'm going to talk about. I'm talking about the last section of Riot. And before I start reading, I'm going to read from my paper and talk a little bit. I thought it might be useful just to linger for a moment on that. First of all, I'm amazed that you're all here at the end of this day on a beautiful day. So thank you for being here. I'm going to try to be pithy, but also say what I want to say. I wanted to just linger for a moment on her epigraph from Martin Luther King Jr., Riot is the language of the unheard. And in a way, if we think about that, as applying also to the poem Riot, just to have in our minds, since we're coming toward the end here, to think about, I've been thinking about listening to all these really wonderful panels and readings from which I've gotten a lot. Speaking is not the same thing as being heard. And what is it that we have heard from Riot? What does Riot hear that in Brooks's work she wasn't able or didn't want to or chose not to hear before? And what might we still not be hearing or need to hear from the poem? So, this is the final section of Riot. This paper is called The Eros in Democracy. As I started writing about this section, I was gripped by a question. And that question is, why does the book-length poem Riot, which details the civic unrest in 1968 Chicago after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, conclude not with a bang, as it were, but with an intimate domestic scene between 2 lovers? What accounts for this private, interior, semi-erotic tableau? Encountering the last section in an anthology, sometimes published separately, you might think the poem reads almost like a love lyric. Most political poetry doesn't. You can imagine, for example, Shelley's The Mask of Anarchy ending with a bedroom scene. It's easier to imagine a version of Riot that ends with a hortatory, impersonal, from on high vision of renewal, something like Auden's We Must Love One Another or Die, or Audre Lorde's The Difference Between Poetry and Rhetoric is Being Ready to Kill Yourself Instead of Your Children. In fact, when Riot was anthologized in the Library of America's The Essential Gwendolyn Brooks, this 3rd section was left out, presumably because the editors considered it less important than the first 2 sections, which are, on a superficial read, more overtly political. But what I want to suggest is that in some deep sense, the politics of this poem lie what's inextricable from its ending, and you can't omit it without neutering or in some sense whitewashing Brooks's vision. Interestingly, we pulled this from the poetry website. I was jealous of Carl and David's handouts, so I needed something to show you. And even on the Poetry Foundation website, there's 2 versions of the poem. One doesn't have this last section, and one has the complete poem. So this 3rd part of Riot is the shortest of the 3 sections. It takes up little more than a page. It comprises 7 stanzas, several of which are one line. I'll just show you the next slide. That's the end. It reads in full, "It is the morning of our love. In a package of minutes there is this we. How beautiful. Merry foreigners in our mourning. We laugh, we touch each other, our responsible props and posts. A physical light is in the room. Because the world is at the window, we cannot wonder very long. You rise. Although genial, you are in yourself again. I observe your direct and respectable stride. You are direct and self-accepting as a lion in African velvet. You are level, lean, remote. There is a moment in camaraderie where interruption is not to be understood. I cannot bear an interruption. This is the shining joy, the time of not to end. On the street, we smile. We go in different directions down the imperturbable street. Because this section is quite different from the first two sections of Riot, which are polyvocal, fragmentary, as some of the things David was talking about, and overtly socio-political in nature, to read Riot is to have to ask why it ends with a vision of collective action by invoking individual and, crucially, I would say, erotic renewal. So as I was thinking about the poem, I came to two interconnected points. For one thing, I think Brooks wanted to push back against the popular, at the time, popular white vision of a, quote, undifferentiated mass of rioters. See, for example, the lines in section 1 when the riots are seen by the white John Cabot. He describes them as we heard the Negroes were coming down the street. They were coming toward him in rough ranks. They were black and loud and not detainable. Instead, Riot concludes with an indelible portrait of black people as individuals, as giddy, optimistic lovers, not as, quote, types or rough ranks. Crucially, I think at the same time, Brooks ends up powerfully reinscribing a Whitmanic vision of democratic ideals in terms of the political goals reflected in the Black arts movement. In a sense, what she does here is to ring a change on the dominant poetic vision of American democracy. The poem's evocation of two people going to bed together, rising, and then walking down a street in, quote, in different directions, would seem for Brooks to be a model of the possibilities of an egalitarian society. In the poem, to model that society, one has to begin, as Whitman did, with the tender connection between two people. So Riot was originally relatively neglected within Brooks's canon, mainly because its political subversiveness led critics, especially white critics of the time, to dismiss it. There's a lot of incredibly condescending reviews that I think we heard a few quotes from them yesterday. They're really worth digging up. Because this section in particular has received little attention, I want to just talk a bit more in detail about it. One thing I came to feel is that the text of Riot complicates a more cut and dried pre- and post-1967 narrative about Brooks's prosody, which there was a panel discussion of this yesterday, and Carl has just been talking about that a bit too. Of course, that's a line I know Brooks herself drew, and Carl just talked about. But as you can hear, one of the interesting things in this piece is the way it is still influenced by her erstwhile modernism, even as it breaks out and breaks forward. So it's quite interesting that critics of the time saw it as so radical a break, because there is a break, but there is also continuity in her prosody. In fact, The Wasteland feels like a shadow sonic text behind Riot. There are surface allusions, the title of the second part, the third sermon, like the fire sermon, the reliance on fire as a destructive and renewing element. There is the sonic overlay of wasteland and warpland, and there are the textual resonances, the use of capitalized words spoken by an external, unidentified voice, the disjunctiveness of the prosody, the difficulty in locating a central speaker, and the alternation of shorter and longer lines. America, Riot implies, is a kind of wasteland following King's death, though not because unrest and riot are illegitimate avenues of political reform. Rather, it's a wasteland because of the very injustice and oppression that led to the riots. What's interesting is that for Brooks, writing about revolution does not mean entirely eschewing the techniques and influences of the poets whose work informed her as a young poet. So this section of Riot isn't so much, strictly speaking, polyvocal, fragmentary, or highly elliptical, some of the things that David talked about, characterizing the first two sections. Tender in tone, it paints a vivid picture of two lovers in a room getting ready to leave it. Maybe they've just woken. Certainly they're just getting out of bed. There is a distinct first-person speaker referring to a you, we see that in the third line, who appears to be a new lover. But for much of the poem, Brooks uses the first-person plural pronouns, we and our, even capitalizing that we really crucially, invoking, I think, an allegorical unity of a group through the metaphor of an erotically entwined couple. A few of the lines, including the first, are in an iambic tetrameter, and many others are in something close to it. So there's a kind of shadowy order that's always about to come into focus sonically beneath the free verse rhythm. That texture is part of what brings Eliot to my mind, because many of his poems play with that kind of line. 4-beat line. The central action of the poem happens about halfway through, and this is where it is. You rise, although genial, you are in yourself again. These lines, to state the obvious, suggest a literal rising from bed following the entanglement and self-forgetfulness of sex. With rising comes a reassuming of individuality and separateness. In fact, the lines are a really beautiful description of an almost universal moment. But given the broader context of the poem, we also have to take the verb rise here in its metaphorical guise. You rise is also evocative of a post-riot social renewal of blacks in America, a vision of what is happening on the streets of Chicago, a rising against oppression. This gesture, which is the crux of the poem, I think, stages the poem's subsequent shift from erotic entanglement to a clear and arresting view of the other as other. The speaker suddenly sees the you as a distinct human with his or her own intentions and qualities, and implicitly his own needs and rights. The next two descriptive lines are unlike anything else in the poem. You are direct and self-accepting as a lion in African velvet. You are level, lean, remote. The speaker doesn't just acknowledge the lover, but bears meaningful testimony to his irreducible being. The adjectives, there's a lot of adjectives suddenly, are worth pausing over. Direct, respectable, self-accepting, African. Nearly all, except African, are explicitly qualitative. Note, too, that this is the one place in the poem that the we breaks down into you and I. Here, Brooks is reinscribing agency and personhood to the lover, and I think implicitly rejecting the reductive racist narratives white society has traditionally imposed on him or her. In their place, she introduces this fresh, particularized vocabulary of recognition, and hence we get that kind of dilating space of the poem with that accrual of all those adjectives. Another significant action of the poem comes at the end, and I think you can see it here, the very final three lines. We go in different directions down the imperturbable street. Another great adjectival moment. Here we find, I think, an example of Brooks's double vision, the way she is trying to capture a sensation of both connection and separation, which David Baker called the double duty of her work. The lovers, still giddy from a night of wonder, walk freely, quote, in different directions. On the one hand, another literal description of a couple parting. On the other, the description extends that metaphorical vision of what it means to be an individual within a collective identity. Having been connected, hopeful in the, quote, morning of their love, the lovers must part, moving into their solitary days. They are at once plural and singular. That word, imperturbable, which means not to be confused or disturbed, is worth pausing over, as I think it does a huge amount of work in the poem. The jacket copy on the back of Riot, which David showed you, tellingly describes the riots as, quote, disturbances. So within the materialist presentation of the work, and Brooks, as I understand, had input on this edition and how it was made, working closely with Broadside Press and with Dudley Randall, imperturbable ends up being a countervision, a counter-history. It evokes an undisturbed street or set of streets where riots are no longer necessary. On such a street, the lovers can part and move on into their lives. It is a vision of a future democratic society, a social space of calm. And I wondered if there was something else going on here, too. Around the time of the publication of Riot, Brooks found herself in the position of being criticized, as it were, from both sides. Conservative white critics had criticized her for abandoning her traditional forms, the tightly made sonnets and persona poems of a street in Bronzeville. And at the same time, some in the Black arts movement thought her work was not radical enough, or felt at least that her earlier body of work, with its modernist influences, suggested an uncritical participation in a hierarchical white literary world. So one could read the end of Riot as Brooks's suggestion that revolution and renewal go necessarily hand in hand with artists and people in the Black community going, quote, in different directions. That is, that there would inevitably be different and sometimes equally valid visions of what change ought to look like. That phrase, in different directions, was actually the title of Library of Congress's Quarterly Journal's 1975 selection of her poems. And it would be interesting, I don't know, maybe someone here does, if she chose that title, or presumably she saw it and had some approval over it. So we see that in this context of Riot, in the third section, Brooks found it necessary to shift her focus to individual intimacy in order to conclude this large poem about equality and revolution. There's an important connection here with Walt Whitman, another of our great political poets. In many ways, Riot offers, I think, an implicit response to a necessary corrective of Whitman's vision in Song of Myself. Whitman's poetry had at its heart a vision of democracy that depended on the eros, or the yearning or desire or love between two individual members. Song of Myself, it's worth remembering, was written partly in response to the deep racial divisions in America in the years before the Civil War. In it, Whitman articulates a vision of democratic unity grounded in erotic love between people and across time. So his vision is this vision of radical identification through yearning and desire. As Whitman stages it, erotic love is the glue that binds democracies, a model for democratic feeling, a kind of erotic pluralism. What democracy demands of us, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum notes in her book Political Emotions, is that our feeling for our fellow citizens is stronger than our distrust or our suspicion of them. One way that happens, she argues, is through love and sympathetic identification that expand what she calls our circle of concern. All decent societies need to guard against division and hierarchy by cultivating appropriate sentiments of sympathy and love, she writes. Her thesis is that art is one of the ways that a liberal society does that. We rely on powerful works of art to jolt us out of divisive feelings or apathy that, as she puts it, inhibit our dealings with one another. So of Whitman's famous elegy for Abraham Lincoln, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, she writes, participating emotionally in Whitman's poem, readers are summoned to throw their full hearts into the search for an America that does not yet exist, but which might become reality. This insight that a kind of eros of identifying with our fellow citizens might enlarge us was, of course, central to Whitman's work and to his project of radical identification with the other. He writes, "And what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you," which at times I love and at times I think, no, it doesn't, right? So in Brooks's poem, equality is driven by a kind of caritas, or love, that must be figured in the intimacy of the body if it is to succeed as a powerful symbol for the broader group. But there's a major difference between them. Crucially, while the first two sections of Brooks's poem feature white people who don't get it, to say the least, right? John Cabot, white people who are racists. But why do these people offend themselves? One of them says in section 2. The third section of Riot includes no white people, none that we know of. So in this sense, Riot participates in the Black arts movement's aesthetic attempt to construct a way of talking about Black culture and Black life that didn't have to include white people and that didn't need white people to be part of the discourse. The vision in this section is inclusive of Blacks, but in some sense indifferent to or even exclusive of whites. In offering this as its culminating democratic vision, Riot enacts a kind of, quote, changing the subject, to borrow from Evie Shockley's characterization of what Brooks excelled at. If Whitman, as a white man in 1855, was saying, "We are equal, you are like me," when he wrote Song of Myself, Brooks, as a Black woman in 1968, is saying, "We are equal, so much so that I don't have to include you in my poem." That is how far we've come. In this way, the end of Riot enacts change, even as it envisions it. It concludes with a vision of democracy that, unlike Whitman's radical identification, is primarily pluralistic, reinforcing the idea that there are important differences among a larger collective. All of us may have equal value, but we walk in, quote, different directions, an image quite different in affect from Whitman's commingling atoms. It's something of a critical truism, or has been, I don't think it's so much now, that the United States has a particularly impoverished tradition of politically engaged literature. Certainly when I was studying English, there was this sense that to write political poetry was somehow to devalue the purity of the lyric. Again, I don't think that's so much the case now. It's also something of a critical truism, or at least an oft-invoked quandary, that, as W.H. Auden put it in his elegy for the poet Yeats, poetry makes nothing happen. But Riot, like Claudia Rankine's Citizen, an American lyric, reminds us of precisely what poetry can do that is different from prose. That is, that poetry is not only able to articulate a vision, but to embody it. Poetry works on the limbic system through the qualities of music. This tradition of American embodiment is crucially somatic and, it's of the body, and ultimately hopeful in the way it crosses bridges and gives voices to the traumas of the culture at large. and people in particular. Brooks's poem ends with a vision of an imperturbable street, a vision that is in crucial ways not yet fully realized. So her challenge remains one we have to take seriously. Riot, like much of her earlier work about the violent history of white lynching, demands the reader ask what she might be blind to. What can I not see, or what am I missing? What does a vision of pluralism mean, and how might we walk someday in different directions along that street? There's a term in medicine that's used to describe the illness that we're blind to. It's an illness that you have to be told you have because it has become so wrapped up with your subjective sense of self that you don't even know you've become sick. And the term, which I'm going to bungle, it's from the Greek, and it's anosognosia. This is usually an illness that's so embedded, it becomes normal, right? It seems to me also a useful term for thinking about the kinds of pathologies that a culture too could suffer from. Pathologies so embedded that we are not necessarily always fully aware of them, that those perpetuating them, rather, are not fully aware of them. I think Riot, in a powerful way, diagnoses that anosognosia, enacting the way a society sees deep wrongs as normal and implicating the reader in her vision. And it's interesting that so many critics failed to see how crucial this tender, modernist influenced and strangely intimate last section of the poet was to the poem's broader achievement. I'm going to end there and just say that I have been thinking about these questions of influence and what has been heard and not heard in the poem, connecting to many things that Nate and other people were saying today and yesterday. So thank you.